Good evening, everyone. Ambassador Mathai and Ambassador Reddy, I'm glad to be here. Thanks to BIC for organizing this event on such a very important topic, because when we have this session, this conflict has been going on for the past 1 year in West Asia, which is India's extended neighborhood. So if you look at West Asia, the West Asia of September 2023, exactly a year ago, the region looked entirely different. From a geopolitical point of view, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor of President Joe Biden, had written an essay in Foreign Affairs in October 2023, arguing that the Middle East has been quieter today than it has been in decades. And this essay went to print on October 2nd. And within a few days, Hamas carried out the October 7 attack. And if you look at it from Jake Sullivan's point of view, or the American point of view, the Abraham Accords that were reached in 2020 between the Arabs and the Israelis were still holding. The Saudis and the Israelis were in an advanced stage of normalizing their relationship, as Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself said in an interview to the CNN. And here in India, in September 2023, when President Biden was here for the G20 summit, they announced the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, proposing to connect India's western coast through the Gulf, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and then across the Mediterranean Sea with Southern Europe. And the Palestine issue, yes, the issue has Israel-Palestine relationship has remained tensed, but the Israelis were treating Palestine as, or the Palestinian resistance as a security nuisance, which they thought that they could continue to tackle it without facing any major consequences. But then October 7 attack happens, which changes the whole regional security dynamics. Now what began as Hamas's attack, or after Israel launched its retaliatory war on Gaza, which the region today is on the cusp of an all-out regional conflict with many more actors. Israel today is fighting two wars on two fronts. Its war in Gaza is still continuing, whereas it launched an invasion of Lebanon last month, which is going on. And then on top of this two-front war, you have an unfolding confrontation between the Israelis and the Iranians. Iran launched 2 direct attacks on Israel this year, and Israel actually attacked the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus. And now, when we are holding this discussion, Israel is planning its next attack on Iran, which is expected to take place before November 5th, according to many reports. So we see, different levels of conflicts in the region, which, of course, will have an impact on the global order or disorder, whatever you would like to call it as well. So to discuss these topics, we have, of course, 2 eminent speakers, Ambassador Mathai, who was our former Foreign Secretary, and Ambassador Reddy, who was former Deputy National Security Advisor. Welcome to the discussion, both of you. So, Ambassador Mathai, I would like to start with, before we go into the global disorder or other regional actors in the conflict, I would like to start with the Palestine question first. Because, before October 7, the Arabs were willing to normalize ties with Israel. The Palestine issue no longer acted as a major deterrent in Arab-Israel normalization process. And Israel also, there was no peace talk going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians for quite some time. The issue has been sidelined to the margins of West Asia. But now, after the past 1 year, after the Hamas attack, of course, in Israel, which killed 1,200 people, and Hamas also took 250 people hostage. And then after that, we have seen unspeakable violence in Gaza, which is still going on. And Israel says Israel would not stop fighting until it reaches absolute victory against Hamas. Hamas claims that they continue to resist the occupation of Palestinian territories. So you have different narratives. You have this violence unfolding before us. So in the context of this ongoing conflict, how do you see the the relevance of the Palestine question or any way forward to address this issue?
Well, I think, thank you. Before I actually answer this question, I'd like to apologize for having turned up late. More than global disorder, I was facing Bangalore disorder from around 4 p.m. this evening when I was outside my apartment waiting for the cab to come and pick me up. But here I am, a little late. Well, to answer the question, I think one must, before talking about this in an academic session, in an academic sense, or as an analyst, start by acknowledging that what we're all witnessing is a really terrible, catastrophic humanitarian situation being faced by a very significant number of people in Gaza, and these are the Palestinian people. That said, I think the Palestinian issue remains kind of central to a final resolution of the issues between Israel and its neighbors, and Israel and, you could say, the larger Arab world. While it is a fact that there were many Arab countries who, over time, had begun to feel that the Palestinians had ceased to have a leadership which seemed capable of arriving at a peace settlement with Israel, and that therefore they must pursue their national interests without necessarily coupling it to a solution of the Palestinian issue. So we have had these moves. You talked about the Abraham Accords. We've talked about the IMEC, which was being planned. We've talked about Israel's plan, which involved a large number of other countries, sometimes covert, sometimes overt. But deep down, many of the leaders know that if there is trouble and if there is a crisis of the kind we see in Gaza, then public opinion gets inflamed very, very quickly and very easily with justified cause. And that none of them, whether they're autocracies or they are semi-constitutional monarchies or whatever form of government they have across the Arab world, they have to reckon with the fact not of public opinion in a democratic sense of day-to-day functioning, but it constrains what they can do and what they cannot do. So to that extent, I think the Palestinian issue, what Hamas has succeeded in doing is bringing it back into the center stage of the Arab discourse.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, I will take the Palestine issue now to the regional crisis. So this is now no longer about Israel and Hamas. Now more actors are also involved in it. As I mentioned earlier, Iran has already carried out 2 attacks on Israel this year. And Israel is also carrying out retaliatory attacks around its neighborhood. So how do you look at the role of Iran? Because the Israelis are saying that this is an evil regime, which is the center of all the problems in the region. And the crisis is also escalating. So the role Iran has been playing in the region and how Israel is looking at it, and what is Iran's response? So what is your view about it?
You know, I personally feel that Iran, both in its attack in April as well as in October, has demonstrated that they will not really stop at anything. They will use their limited defense capacities because, as you know, obviously the Israeli defense capacity is far larger than the Iranian defense capacity. But whatever they have, they are throwing at Israel. And the October 1st attack, or for that matter, the April attack, what they've been able to do is to launch ballistic missiles. And they've had a few hits in Central and Southern Asia with this latest attack. And many, the Israelis claim, have been blocked by their own air defense systems. Netanyahu has responded aggressively. And the US, of course, backs Israel. Iran is trying to avenge the deaths of Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah and IRGC's Abbas Nilforashan. And they died in Israeli strikes in Lebanon in September 27th on Beirut, and Ismail Haniyeh, who was killed in Tehran itself. My own feeling is that Iran FM Arakji has called the attack self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. And they claim their aim has only been to target military and security sites in charge of genocide in Gaza. He said Iran had patiently waited for a ceasefire. And he said their response was now done, it was final, unless there was further retaliation from the Israeli side, which is what we are anticipating now, that by, as you say, by November 5th, there may be some retaliatory attack by Israel. In April, of course, they launched the first strike, Iran. And hundreds of ballistic missiles and UAVs were then launched also. Biden persuaded Israel at that time to limit its response, and which effectively showed its military superiority with deep penetration into Iran. You know, asymmetry in defense capacities, as I said, is obvious. Iran has therefore avoided till now further confrontations. But after April, only a sort of shadow war prevailed. A feeling in Iran that deterrence had been restored. After November 23rd, there have been a series of, November 23rd of last year, there have been a series of body blows, I would call them, to Iran. There have been airstrikes, covert ops, deaths of several leaders, whether of IRGC, Hamas or Hezbollah. The Operation True Promise by Iran in April was a retaliatory strike. Israeli attacks decimated multiple layers of leadership in Hamas, Hezbollah, and IRGC. Israel wanted to eliminate as many high-level military personnel from Iran as possible, basically. They also wanted to cripple and dismantle Iran's hardware by striking missile and launch facilities and the infamous pager attack, where scores of people were killed and mutilated when they blew up the pagers in Lebanon. Iran now claims it was forced to respond, and the axis of resistance, as they call it, is under threat. And Khomeini has decided to retaliate. And I think Iran's October 1st strike has multiple messages. Firstly, it domestically assuages the hardliners who've been calling for revenge for the death of Nasrallah and others. Both Hamas and Hezbollah are now severely crippled. After Hamas's October 7th attack, that was the previous year, of course, Hezbollah bombings began in northern Israel. By September 2024, Hezbollah claimed that it had carried out 2,785 attacks versus Israel in 1 year. Iraq also launched 170 attacks separately in both Iraq and onto Israel. Netanyahu, I think the immediate provocation for the October attack was that Netanyahu broadcast an address directly to the Iranian people, asking them to rise against the theocracy, the theocratic regime in power. This was a direct provocation. And the next day, if you see, the attacks began from Israel. So Israeli response is now awaited. We have to wait and see how it goes. So that's as far as Iran goes.
So in April, when the Iranians launched the attack, they had let the Americans know apparently in advance, 3 days in advance.
That's right. And this time they didn't.
This time there was no prior information.
No prior.
So they actually wanted to hurt Israel this time.
They did. Because this was retaliation for the killing of their leaders, leadership in the both Hamas and Hezbollah.
Yeah. So if I look at the chain of events, which ma'am also described here, what I see, correct me if I'm wrong, what I see is that it was Israel that took the war to Iran. It was Israel that bombed the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus. And Nasrallah opened what he called a support front immediately after the Gaza war, but he was fighting a limited war from southern Lebanon. But then Netanyahu decided to escalate the conflict against Hezbollah in July. Apparently, I think it was on July 30th, he killed Fouad Shukr, the Hezbollah commander. Why is this? Why is Israel escalating the conflict?
Well, Israel is escalating the conflict because it sees this present moment in history as a window of opportunity to reduce its most critical enemies drastically in strength and ability. But I'd like to put in a little caveat on some of the assumptions we all make when we talk about Lebanon and Iran and Israel provocations, etc. See, I make a distinction between what I said about Gaza and what I would say about Lebanon or Iran. For both Lebanon and Iran, the current conflict with Israel and its history is a war of choice. For the Palestinians, it's a war of survival. It's a fight back. Neither Iran has really no locus standi in the Palestinian issue. It's not a neighbor. It has no territorial dispute. It has no issues. Lebanon, to some extent, had when the Palestinian refugees had crossed over into that territory and the Iranians carried their war against those people into southern Lebanon. Hezbollah actually was created at that time as a resistance movement, which took over an initial internal resistance movement, which was Amal. It virtually sidelined Amal. But in 2000, I was actually in Israel. They withdrew from Lebanon, and the United Nations certified that they have completed their withdrawal from Lebanon. So why is Hezbollah carrying on a fight against Israel? It doesn't allow the Palestinians who used to be there to come back to the border regions. It is a resistance movement. It is a resistance movement which is fighting against the Lebanese government. It has today overawed the Lebanese. It has an army larger than the Lebanese army. Its writ runs stronger in large parts of the country than the government of Lebanon does. So for them to claim that there was a provocation from Israel is a bit of a stretch when you compare it with the situation of Hamas and Palestine. For the Iranians, it's even more. Iran, till 1979, had good relations with Israel, but it has chosen, for ideological reasons and for geopolitical reasons, to create an axis of resistance to take over leadership of a popular movement against Israel. So I think the Israelis feel, and large parts of American opinion, perhaps West European opinion, some opinion not far from here in our own capital, holds that they are justified in doing so. They are fully capable of taking care of Iran. But there's one very special situation which has arisen. The Israelis seem to have calculated, and their calculations are reasonably good most of the time, that the Iranian regime is today at one of its weakest moments. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And that given enough outside pressure, the internal forces against the regime as it is could either mutate the regime or bring it down. I don't know. I have lived in Iran during an earlier period in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a transition from Khomeini to Khamenei. And if there is a transition again, you could have a bit of a shake-up. But I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. But certainly their ability to kill Haniyeh when he was a guest of the government of Iran for their inauguration of their president in a safe house of the IRGC, to kill, the ability to kill nuclear scientists to march into the atomic energy center of Iran, take away hundreds of documents, take them out, take them to Israel, photocopy them, and show them in the UN. I mean, this shows penetration of an extraordinary kind. I don't think this has ever happened in recent Iranian history. So there is something that we need to watch very carefully about the internal Iranian situation. But that kind of explains why Israel is going for broke, as it were. It is carrying out an absolutely maximalist strategy. And when it comes to Lebanon and Israel, it has supporters. When it comes to Palestine, largely it does not. And this is something which I think Netanyahu is gambling, that because the geopolitical situation favors him, public opinion will not react to his attempts to, quote unquote, settle the Palestinian issue. What is he trying to do? I have to claim no credit for this analysis. This is a lecture by Professor Mearsheimer, the well-known professor, who has turned out to be a very severe critic of at least Netanyahu and his government. And he said they have now 4 options. One is the same slogan which Hamas uses, which is from the river to the sea, from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea is one state. Okay, now when the Palestinians and Hamas sings it, they're talking about a Palestinian state. When some of Netanyahu's followers are trying to do that, they're talking about a Jewish state. So what will they do? There are 7.5 million Palestinians between the river and the sea. What are they going to do? He says there are 4 options. One, you have a unified state, which no Israeli is willing to countenance. You have apartheid, in which you rule and you convert this large body of people into second-class citizens. Everyone knows that that's not sustainable over time. The third is a 2-state solution, which every sensible person in the world, including our leadership, stands for. And at the moment, it is only certain cabinet members of Netanyahu's government and Netanyahu himself, and increasingly a significant section of the Israeli population which says, no way, we've tried this, it's not going to work, no 2-state solution. And what's the 4th? Ethnic cleansing. Now, you can, they say that the laboratory is Gaza. But even in Gaza, you're talking 1 million+ people. Where are you going to send them? Where are you going to send them? Egypt has already said, no way the Sinai is going to take these people. So what is this maximalist strategy leading to? There's a conspiracy theory which is being built up. I have no evidence to prove it, but I'll just throw it into it. Ariel Sharon, the former leader of Israel, once asked about a Palestinian state. He said, a Palestinian state already exists. Its capital is Amman. Its name is Jordan. 70% of Jordan is Palestinian. So you hive off a few parts of the West Bank and attach them to Jordan and say, there's your Palestinian state. The rest is all Israel. But what are you going to do with 1 million, 2 million people in Gaza and all the rest in the West Bank? They have no solution to this. So I'm afraid they're stuck, and they're dragging the rest of West Asia down the path of continued difficulty, continued crisis, as far as the eye can see.
Just 2 associated questions. So you said Iran has no locus standi in this when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue. So can I... Israeli argument. So can we use the same argument to refer to the presence of the United States in the region? Because the United States continues to back Israel irrespective of Israel's tactics on the Palestinians. It's a faraway country. And then second question that you said, Israeli troops withdrew from Lebanon in 2000. But Hezbollah would say that Israel continues to occupy the Sheba farms of Lebanon. And they said that they continue to resist the Israeli occupation of Sheba farms. I would like to know, how do you look at it?
Well, I was there when this Sheba farms issue broke in 2000, and we all studied the maps and looked at the history and so on. But the point is that the United Nations certified that the withdrawal from Lebanon is complete. The Sheba Farms was occupied by Israel when it took over the Golan Heights in 1967. At that time, Sheba Farms was part of the Golan Heights and part of Syria. Now, if you go back in history, both Syria and Lebanon were under French mandate or French rule prior to the Second World War. And there are differing versions of history, but some say that the Sheba Farms paid taxes to the Lebanese, but they were controlled by the Syrians. But in 1948-49, when Syria drew the maps of its territory, Sheba Farms was in Syria. It was part of the Golan Heights. In 2000, seeing an opportunity, they said, no, actually Sheba Farms is part of the Golan Heights, but actually there are some documents which show that it could be part of Lebanon. So they kind of disassociated themselves. But the fact is, on the UN's maps, Sheba Farms is shown as Golan Heights, Syria, and the UN certified that they have completed their withdrawal.
From Lebanon.
From Lebanon. And in fact, the UN resolutions 1559 and 1701 have said that it's time for the Lebanese government to reassert its authority in southern Lebanon. They didn't include Sheba Farms in that. And who is standing in the way of the Lebanese government reasserting its authority in southern Lebanon? It's Hezbollah. You ask any of the Indians who have been peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, they'll confirm this. Hezbollah acts as a state within a state. It listens to nobody, but it claims to be the axis of resistance, so we don't question it.
I'll come back to Hezbollah.
On the United States, yes, you have a point. Theoretically, no outside power has the capacity. But the fact is that without the United States, there will be no movement on this issue. The Palestinians themselves recognize this. And they regularly seek, the Palestinian Authority, not the Hamas, regularly seeks American intervention and requests it.
So, yeah, please, ma'am.
I just wanted to touch on one point, where you said that Iran has never been weaker than at this moment,
Israeli perception.
Okay, Israeli perception. But I think there is a seed of truth in that because, right now the Iranian people themselves are very, very cynical. And they say, why are we fighting for Palestine? Why are we fighting for Lebanon? We should put our own interests first. Iran should come and our own national interests, our own problems, the soaring inflation and so on and so forth, should come before we take an interest in what is happening in Lebanon or in Gaza. And that, I think, is what makes the Iranian state particularly vulnerable at this time.
Just a point, it's not Iran per se, but the regime which is ruling Iran.
Exactly. So now there is a very real danger, of, and given that and Netanyahu's appeal to the Iranian people, there is, I would say, a reasonable chance of people perceiving in Iran that they have a chance of overthrowing the theocracy, the theocratic government. And that will make for even more instability within Iran, and even rogue elements being able to control the nuclear system, etc. So it's a very troubling situation, actually, to try to engineer a regime change in Iran has very, very serious implications.
And in the case of Iran, everybody has been trying to engineer a regime change from 1979 onwards.
Exactly.
So it's been 4 decades. It's been. And one point, ma'am, I would like to ask you. Ambassador referred to Professor Mershamer's 4 scenarios.
Yes.
And he talked about apartheid.
Yeah.
You were in South Africa.
That's right.
In the early 1990s.
Yeah.
You saw the transition.
Yes.
And there is a serious criticism about the way Israel is running the occupied territories, whether it is Gaza, which was under blockade, or West Bank, which is under the direct military occupation, and the Israel proper, where you have democracy, elections, rights, free judiciary, free media, etc., etc. So do you see any similarity between what happened in South Africa, which was an apartheid regime, and what is happening in Israel, or what Professor Mearsheimer calls Greater Israel, which includes Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, where Israel is facing a serious criticism of running an apartheid state?
I think the difference is the question of leadership. South Africa was fortunate in that they had a leader like Nelson Mandela, who had the sense to see that, he needed to bring all the people together. I don't think there's been that wisdom and vision in West Bank or in Gaza, for that matter. I think the feeling there has been of we are a persecuted people, etc. And the level of leadership there, whether it was, whoever it was before or the present leadership, has not been of a good nature, of a high enough nature to overcome any obstacles and to come to any accommodation. As Ranjan mentioned, the idea that everything belongs to us is a Palestinian slogan. That they wanted all of it. They wanted all of what is now Israel to be Palestine. And that's not a tenable position. They didn't want a two-state solution. They wanted a one-state solution, which would be a Palestinian state. So I think the real question is that if you don't have visionary leadership, you cannot reach a solution. So the question of having a leader of the stature of Nelson Mandela doesn't even arise, because nobody has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nobody has talked about how we forgive each other, how we reconcile these differences. And so, Palestinian leadership has been lacking in this aspect. So that is the real reason, I believe, that the Palestinian cause has not been able to advance forward. And this insistence on maximalist positions, they don't want a two-state solution. Israel doesn't want a two-state solution. Where do you go from here?
Thank you. So now, if you look at the position Indian government has taken, especially over the past 1 year, so India historically has been a vocal supporter of the Palestinian cause. And if you look at the official position, the government still says that India strongly supports a two-state solution. And I could also see that at the UN, India voted in favor of 4 resolutions that clearly recognizes Palestinian self-determination, etc., etc. But overall, there is a growing criticism that India remains silent, even when there is this mounting humanitarian crisis in Gaza. 40,000 people have been killed. Almost the entire population of Gaza has been displaced, etc., etc. So how do you look at overall India's position towards the Palestine issue, particularly in the last 1 year?
Well, I think there's a case can certainly be made that we could have been more vocal on issues, humanitarian issues. But I think the focus in Delhi is on the Indian national interest, which is to say that for us, and we can come to that when we are talking about the position of various extra-regional powers in West Asia as a whole, the region is of critical importance, and the restoration of some kind of order across it is very, very vital. I think what started the tendency towards silence was the scale of what Hamas was able to do on the 7th of October, which I think many Israelis say perhaps since 1948, in a single day or two, they have not taken casualties on this scale, and they make a very serious case about the brutality with which the attack was carried out against women, children, people at a celebration, and so on. I think that struck home very strongly to India, which is also a victim of terrorism. So the initial response and that sense of horror has not gone away. And the belief that the making statements constantly will help resolve the situation is a bit overstated, I think. So the general sense in Delhi, I think, is that what are we going to achieve by being critical of Israeli actions or talking about the humanitarian situation? If there is an action by which we can help, I think we would be willing to help the United Nations in restoring whatever it can, or the Red Cross or the others. But we have not got there. So I think there's a certain degree of, candidly, self-interest in not being too vocal. You have a very good relationship with Israel. You find also that the countries which really matter to you in the Arab world, which is in the Gulf, and perhaps to some extent Egypt and some of the other large Arab states, they're also, apart from occasional statements, not terribly vocal about it. Much of the noise is actually emerging from civil society and civil society driven protests in Europe, in many parts of the Arab world, and now increasingly even in the United States, Canada, and many other countries across the world. So someone asked that, okay, what is the organized OIC, which gets so worked up on many other issues? What have they recently said or done about Gaza? Have they raised a fund to help? Have they approached the UN saying you must take a mission there? So India standing up and sort of barnstorming on it is not going to achieve a lot. I think that is the kind of calculation which exists in Delhi on this.
So this middle path, you think, is serving India's national interests?
I believe so. I believe so, because we have kept lines of communication open to the key Arab partners. I know the discussions have been held with UAE not so long ago, with Saudi Arabia. These are the two key countries as far as we are concerned. We have had interactions with Egypt. We continue, incidentally, to talk to the Iranian government about our bilateral relations as well as regional issues. So we've kept lines of communication open, but our link with Israel is today very, very vital to us, and we'd like to keep that intact. Not that it's actually flourishing just now because Israel is so preoccupied with its war, but that said, we need that relationship.
Why it's vital? Can you explain?
It's vital from the point of view of defense, intelligence, and technology. The technology, the general assumption is that it's all defense related, not necessarily so. We do a lot of work in agriculture, desalination, and so on. But the fact, quite plainly, is the key is defense and intelligence, security.
Ma'am, so again, when we talk about India's policy, how do you look at India's ties with Iran in this context? Because it was after the April attack, you talked about the April attack, when Ebrahim Raisi was still around, India signed the Chabahar Redevelopment Agreement with the Iranians. And then, you see, India, External Affairs Minister had traveled to Tehran, so India wanted to maintain its engagement with Iran. But at the same time, Khamenei, the supreme leader, had tweeted recently raising the issue of minorities being oppressed in several countries, including India. Mm. So, do you see any strain in Indo-Iranian relationship, or how do you look at how does New Delhi look at Tehran?
You know, the Iranian-Indian relationship has been complicated for a long time. Part of the reason has been the sanctions regime in Iran. You know, that's made the whole question of our payment for Iranian oil shipments very complex. And I myself was engaged in negotiations with Iran on this question of payments. And they are very obdurate that they want it to be done in a particular way, you know, through foreign exchange transactions. We've suggested rupee transactions to overcome this problem. But they are very insistent, and then they are not able to come up with solutions because they are so internationally isolated by the sanctions, the banking sanctions and others, that no bank is prepared to really engage in this trade. So, Iran was very angry with us because of this, because we were suggesting a rupee exchange. And they are very difficult to negotiate with. Iran is not an easy country to deal with. Like I remember, I had a marathon session with their Deputy National Security Advisor when I was, which went on for 7.5 hours. It was very wearying because they have no concept of negotiation being that you give a little and take a little. It's like a maximalist position. So I think negotiating with Iran has always been difficult for various reasons. And I don't see them really being able to relax their position in order to accommodate Indian interests, which is why the Chabahar agreement becomes interesting. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to move forward. Financing is an issue, definitely, because international agencies will not finance the Chabahar project, so it would all have to come from the Indian side. And frankly, I think at the moment, everybody is too preoccupied with the crisis itself and the ongoing clash between Iran and Israel to really concentrate on Chabahar. So I don't see that really progressing in the near future.
Just adding to what you said, I was in Tehran in 2020 February, 2022, right after the Ukraine war broke out. So we were talking to an Iranian diplomat, and we also got a sense that the relationship actually strained. A lot of issues were there. And this Iranian diplomat was telling us that, I mean, you want to engage us only if the Americans approve of it. So otherwise, you stay away from us. So that's the Iranian point of view.
Yeah.
So they were also very critical.
Yeah.
So now let's go to the title of today's discussion, the global disorder. It's interesting, I mean, as a student of IR, when I look at what's happening in the world, so I see two major conflicts in Europe. Russia's war with Ukraine is going on. And here in West Asia, there is a major conflict is unfolding before us. And in Russia is getting support from the Iranians. They have sent the drones. The Europeans are also accusing Iran of supplying ballistic missiles to the Russians. And now Iran is going to face another attack from the Israelis. So two questions. One, these conflicts, do you see any links between these two conflicts when you look at the global order? And then secondly, a hypothetical question. If the crisis in West Asia escalates into a full-blown war, do you foresee the Russians coming to Iran's defense?
I'd like to, I mean, you mentioned global order. So since that was the title of this thing, I decided to look at what exactly is global order. And, we all talk about it, world order, global order. So I looked around for various ways of explaining it. And the first interesting one I came across was in a book by Henry Kissinger, of course, who's both famous and notorious at the same time. And he said, what is global order? He said, global order is a concept held by a region or a civilization about the nature of just arrangements and the distribution of power thought to be applicable to the whole world. And international order is the practical application of these concepts to a substantial part of the globe, enough to affect global balance of power. So now if you look at West Asia, Russia and Ukraine is a huge subject by itself. The global order as it stands in West Asia, you began by referring to what Hamas did to overturn a status quo which everybody was happy with. Everybody was not happy with it, but frankly, that was the global order at that given point of time. And what was that global order? Global order was basically the whole region, irrespective of internal differences in relationship between one country and Russia, one country and China. By and large, it was part of an American dominated global order. Not unipolar, certainly not, but largely an American dominated one. The dollar is the only currency which matters throughout this region. And while everyone claims that because the US is self-sufficient in oil, it's not interested in the oil markets, is a complete myth. Because oil is important to your adversaries, they will continue to be very interested in it. And they have demonstrated that. So this kind of order was what has started getting shaken up. Now, what is the Chinese interest in this order? The Chinese interest in this order is to make inroads for their own sense of a new world order in which the Belt and Road Initiative will shift power a little away from the maritime to the internal lines of communication in Eurasia, increase Chinese influence to the point where many of these countries will gravitate towards a Chinese-led order rather than stick with the current one. The Russians, well, they were the only other serious player in this region, as they demonstrated in 2015 when they went and literally saved Syria from destruction. It was on the verge of destruction. At that point, even the Americans could not do anything about it. Today, I'm afraid the Russians have been so debilitated, that is the only word I can use, by their ongoing war with Ukraine, which has highlighted a number of military, technological, and other weaknesses in their system, that they may not be able to come to the assistance of Iran on the scale you are mentioning. But what is the interests of the others? I mean, these three we all know. These are the villains of the piece in any given order. The closest is us. What are we doing? If there is a serious breakdown there's a war which spills across this aerial war between Israel and Iran, or if Iran decides to extend it across land borders, maritime borders, it's going to affect that part of the Arab world which is most vital to us. That is the Gulf region. Leave everything else out. Oil will be a crisis which we will face in about 3 weeks because we have enough reserves to survive for 3 weeks. There's 7 million Indians. We evacuated a few 100,000 and we had a huge crisis on our hands. There's no way you're going to even contemplate this kind of a crisis. So we should be very concerned about a breakdown of order, whether it's an American-run order or whoever else's order. Now, the Chinese in 2023, April, I think, brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which led everyone to say that, look, now this is the era of Chinese influence, etc. But what has China been able to do in the last 1 year? It called one meeting of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. They called them to Beijing. But they've been able to do nothing. They can't influence the situation on the ground. So order in this part of the world continues to be part of the global order, which is largely US dominated. The attempts by Iran, Lebanon, the axis of resistance, and Hamas to overturn this have not succeeded. They have led to a counter by Israel, which, if carried to its logical extreme, could also pose a threat to the order. If they decide, for example, to dispel people forcibly, that would be a significant challenge to the global order. Russia and Ukraine is a different question and of a larger order. I don't think that really challenges the global order to the same extent, at least if you listen to the Russian narrative, which is just resolving a problem which was created for them by the aggressiveness of NATO. But there's a stalemate presently. If in the next few weeks, next month, they are able to take Pokrovsk and break the back of resistance in the Donetsk, we might see an end to the war. So I don't put it on the same scale of potential to create global disorder.
Ma'am, your comments.
My comments are, obviously the US continues to be Israel's powerful ally. And most of the West backs Israel. Only Macron has called for an arms embargo on Israel. I think the Gulf countries have been largely neutral. I would agree with Ranjan on that. Though, of course, Qatar hosts Hamas top leadership. Iran finds itself internationally isolated, shunned to a large extent by the Muslim world as well. It's ostracized by the West. China and Russia are supposedly friends of Iran, but I feel they're also playing a wait and watch game. I don't think they would get actively involved unless it's in their own interest to do so. And as I mentioned earlier, there could be an anti-theocratic regime move in Iran. So, frankly, I see the situation today that Iran and Israel, this is actually a quote from someone else, are circling each other like sumo wrestlers and trying to see who gets in a strike first. And India is doing its balancing act. But I would say, yes, I agree again with Ranjan that we are largely pro-Israel. So the international situation is not good for Iran. That's the way I look at it.
Add one thing. I don't think the Iranians have ever particularly worried too much about, trying to garner support from X and Y and so on, except when they are in difficulty. It's a common belief that they have a very close relationship with China, which is true up to an extent because only the Chinese are buying large or significant amounts of Iranian oil today. But they had this huge 25-year agreement, massive investments were supposed to flow from China into Iran and so on. 2 years down the line, I think 0.8% of the level of investments had actually arrived. And the Chinese efforts to increase their presence in Iran led to a backlash. Of all people, by the ex-president Ahmadinejad, a well-known radical. He was one of those who was opposing this Chinese move. The Iranian slogan, neither east nor west, I think still has resonance. It's important to remember that if there is one country in the world which has a very exalted impression about its role in history and itself and so on, it is Iran. The Shah of Iran famously said, we are going to be the 5th largest economy in the world. And there were some revolutionaries who believed something similar. They haven't entirely given that up.
And how do you look at the difficulties which Israel is facing if we talk about the other actor in this conflict? Because internally, Israel is facing a lot of challenges. This is a far-right government. There are 2 extremist parties which are part of this government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And then Israel, there were massive protests going on inside Israel. And internationally, Israel is facing a lot of isolation, especially after the Gaza war broke out. Of course, they continue to enjoy the support of the United States, but still there is a genocide case against Israel at ICJ. The UN probe just last week said that Israel has committed crimes against humanity and war crimes in Gaza. So there is a lot of international criticisms and then internal upheaval. And Netanyahu himself is facing political challenges, and the war is going on forever. So how do you look at the challenges Israel is facing?
It's facing very severe challenges. Many of its internal crises, and they are crises, have got covered up, papered over, or patched because there is a foreign threat, there is an external threat. And that has happened repeatedly in Israeli history. They're an extremely fractious democracy, not unlike us, you might say. And what has added to the difficulties is the growing cleavage in the society between the people who created Israel and the ideology under which Israel was created, and the kind of largely secular tendency within that ideology and what is the reality of Israel today. It's a very, very different country. And Netanyahu is trying to sit on two stools at the same time. If there is anyone more secular than he in personal life, that's Netanyahu. Whatever he may say outside for religious reasons. The Israeli society has changed and changed dramatically in the 21st century. When I served there, and when the last effort to really resolve the Palestinian crisis, the Camp David talks, Israel was still had leaders who were those who had created the state of Israel. They had seen the struggle, the sheer fight for survival with which they had come up and built it literally with bare hands. People have forgotten that in the 50s and so on, they didn't have this massive US support which they have today. But they built that state, defended it, created it, built it on certain values. Many of those who came in later from across the world, those who have grown up with new ideologies in the 21st century, who have grown up in a system in which they are an advanced, high-tech financial power to reckon with almost unlimited support from extreme Jewish groups in the Western world. They take for granted many things which earlier Israelis didn't. And this cleavage is very, very significant. And what has added to it is the growing influence of the religious right. Israel always had a strong ultra-religious group. And in fact, it was Ben Gurion, I think, who actually gave them exemption from compulsory military service, which the secular Israelis really resent. But today, there are significant section of the population. Some of them actually do join the army, but not to serve in the army as they know, but to change the army. Today, 30% of the young officers in some courses are people whose background is actually religious. And the demonstration of how bad this has got is the fight over Netanyahu, the judicial independence, and so on, which nearly brought his government down. But this war seems to have bailed him out. But these problems will not go away. Recently, there was a horrifying incident which a lot of senior army officers were shaken by, was the torture and rape, male rape of prisoners in the West Bank. Yeah. And when the army, true to its style, called in the Judge Advocate General and charged the whole lot of them, you had attacks on the army camps by people from the ultra-religious right. You had Ben-Gvir and Smotrich coming up and saying, no way you're going to touch our soldiers. So there is a crisis within that society which won't go away soon. But as long as there is a war and a sense that, we are again in an existential situation, everything takes a back seat. And one doesn't know if Israeli society does get changed to this extent. You may have a long-term issue of emigration of some of their brightest minds who will say, do it without us. So there is a potential problem down the road.
I saw a report, at least 500,000 Israelis left the country since October 7 last year.
That includes, I think, a lot of tourists, many of whom will come back, but a significant number. And what is important is they mostly head to the US, and some of their technological elites, people who have built their financial wizardry, have gone. Some people are confident that if peace is restored, they will come back. But if the society itself is changing, then I think they need to worry. And I think serious minds are worried.
I have two more questions to both of you. After that, we will open it up for the audience. Ma'am, the first one is specific to what we are discussing. The second one is a bit generic. The first one is that, is the two-state solution still viable?
I don't think so, because as I said earlier, Israel doesn't want a two-state solution. Palestine is not prepared for a two-state solution. So I don't see how this theory can advance.
What is the way forward? What do you see?
Frankly, I don't see an immediate way forward. I only see the conflict escalating, and I see a very bleak future. as far as Iran and Israel are concerned.
So,
I think there is no solution except a two-state solution. It's not likely very soon. But let's not forget, I mean, when we talk of the river to the sea and all, this is the Hamas doctrine.
Oh.
The Palestinian Authority, weak, corrupt, ineffective as it is, if it is able after, on the destruction of this war, to rebuild its cadres and grow, then there may be an attempt at least to bring in some kind of a limited administration. You see, one of the reasons the two-state solution broke, at least from the Israeli point of view, was that the Palestinian Authority under Arafat was not willing to accept half a loaf. He wanted the full loaf. Not the whole of Israel, but all the occupied territories. Well, serious Israelis who were keen on peace told him, start with this, give it 20 years and maybe things will change if there is peace. That, I think, is the only way out, because there's been too much bloodshed, there's too much suspicion of each other. Unless there is a long interim period when there is an administration, the Palestinians are able to rebuild some kind of a life, and the Israelis no longer fear that that administration's aim is to destroy the state of Israel, then I think some kind of a limited two-state solution may be possible. But right now, it doesn't look possible, and the kind of scenario which Latha mentioned seems more likely.
Can I make one more point on
sure.
this? You know, basically, I think that unless the two sides really retract from their positions, there's not going to be a movement forward. That is why I feel that it's going to be very, very difficult at this stage, because both have taken maximalist positions. So that's where we are today. And, you know, I really hate to be pessimistic. I'm an optimist by nature, as you know. But in this case, I'm afraid one has to sound a note of warning.
So one final question. You both were foreign policy practitioners. Ambassador Mathai said that India's middle policy is actually serving India's national interests. My question is, how important is morality in foreign policy?
I'm afraid morality today has been trumped by a realpolitik. You know, the old idea of ethics, values, you know, the Nehruvian idea that we need to be an example to the world, we need to lead by example, etc., is no longer valued in this country. So I don't see this as advancing in any way.
Well, every nation acts in its own self-interest, so it's not unique to us. Every nation asks this question from time to time, is morality relevant, and so on. There are times when it does seem that society demands, the polity demands, and you do act in certain moral ways. But most of the time you act on self-interest as defined economically, technologically, militarily, politically, above all politically. But somehow, deep down, never forget, morality is always one set, a yardstick against which you are judged. Now, why that is the case is a question we need to answer. But that is a question which remains on the table all the time. Is what you are doing, quote unquote, right? It may be opportune. And you may say you're not doing it because it's opportune, but throughout history, you'll find this again and again when you read it. At some point, this question does get raised. Now, why it is for philosophers to answer. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ranjan Mathai and Ambassador Latha Reddy. Now we will open this session for questions from the audience. So please.
Thank you for your deep insight on the geopolitical theater which is taking place in the Middle East. And I would just ask you to weigh in on not how nations and countries have sort of how they've shaped up, but how public sentiment globally has been influenced in the last year. And the reason I ask for that is I'm a little baffled at the extent. Yeah, I'm a little baffled at the extent of global outrage, in particular on what's happening over the last year. Not just college kids in US campuses. There were protests here in the streets in Bangalore. Especially when we look at all the intra-Arab violence over the last decade, whether we look at Syria, we look at what's happening in Congo, in Sudan. Why is it that whenever it comes to Israel and its neighboring states, these conflicts get so much more attention than the million people displaced just in the last year in the Congo, for example? Is it subconscious anti-Semitism, or is there some other explanation for what's happening amongst
I think it's certainly not anti-Semitism. So let's get that red herring out of the way. But it's a very, very valid point you've made. Let's not go to Congo or other parts of Africa. Syria. This self-same Hezbollah, which I referred to earlier, got involved in fighting on behalf of the Assad regime against the internal opponents of that regime in 2013, 12-13 onwards. It joined with the Iranians in bailing that government out on many occasions. There's an article written by a former United Nations official, Francesco Bardini, in which he refers to the siege of Aleppo and the destruction of Aleppo, in which Hezbollah was definitely involved. 25,000 civilians are supposed to have died in that. Not hardly anybody, if I were to ask anybody, has anybody heard of this? No, you haven't. When Nasrallah was killed, they distributed sweets in Aleppo and Idlib. So that's what I'm saying. Your point is very valid. There is a great focus on the Israel-Palestine issue because it, for one thing, this region is the crossroads, literally the crossroads of the world. It's West Asia to us, it's Middle East to the others, and it's very, very vital. Secondly, it's been on the United Nations the agenda, and to that extent, it proves the point I was trying to say. Somehow it has remained as a yardstick against what is right and what is wrong. Now, you can argue in favor of Israel and say that, this has been exaggerated, Israel has suffered and so on, but that somehow does remain. And that is why there is outrage over it, and there's relatively little over Sudan, Congo, Syria, for that matter, or what has happened inside Iran, what has happened in Armenia quite recently. 150,000 people thrown out of their houses where they had lived for 5 centuries. No one batted an eyelid. So this is a question. Somehow this does remain very much on the agenda. I do not think it is anti-Semitism. I think it is a genuine interest in this region since it was created by an act of the international community. It's got this whole resonance which is religious of the recreation, the rebirth of the state of Israel, the third holiest place of Islam, Jerusalem, and so on. So it resonates. How do you can't replicate some of those global interest features in most other parts of the world. That's the only explanation I can arrive at. And of course, to some extent, it is because of Western, particularly United States, UK involvement, and the media domination of the world, the continued news flow domination by the Western media. So this tends to be part of the reasoning. That's the way I see it.
If I can just add to that, I would agree with Ranjan that I don't see any anti-Semitism in this reaction. But what I do see is there's been a very effective, how shall I put it, a global projection of, I would say, propaganda in a sense about the whole Gaza issue. For some reason, this has captured public imagination in a way that other crises have not. And I think that's really the reason. Could be that social media is even more active today than it's been in the past. It could be for that reason. It could be, again, as Ranjan has mentioned, because of the religious aspect of the conflict. But whatever the reason, I think it's not that you're uncaring about the other crises, that nobody cares about what happens in Congo or Syria or anything else, but this has somehow gripped the public imagination in a way that nothing else has.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, I have 4 questions.
One for now,
okay.
I think.
Yeah. Difficult. But I'll go with the first one. These are all based on everything which has been discussed in the panel. So the first is, in light of the rise of maximalist tendencies, as you mentioned, over negotiative approaches in some countries, what insights can you share about the future of diplomacy in this context?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, I think diplomacy will always have a role to play. I don't see diplomacy as a zero-sum game at all, you know, but in diplomacy, you have to basically negotiate. And, you know, there has to be a bit of give and take. The reason why this particular crisis doesn't lend itself to that is because of the, as you said, the maximalist positions taken by these countries. But in most cases, in the case of most international crises, I think diplomacy has a very big role to play and will continue to have this role. Because in most cases, you're negotiating with people who are prepared to give a little, take a little, and so on and so forth. So definitely diplomacy continues to be useful as a tool. And, you know, as Shyam Saran said, you know, the missile is foreign policy, and the vector or the delivery system is diplomacy. So diplomacy will always continue to have a role. Ranjan, you want to add to that?
Yes, I think the short point which you concluded with, war is diplomacy by other means. It's your attempt to give and take. And all you need is one serious setback on the battlefield, and you will find some of the positions beginning to change. No, maybe we can think about this other solution, etc., etc., etc. But right now, I think everyone is waiting. The major actors is waiting for the 5th of November or whenever we'll know who's the occupant of this chair in the White House, for cues on how to take things forward. At least the Israelis are. And to some extent, some of the other players in West Asia are. Diplomacy remains important, but when war is the dominant feature, it does tend to take a slight backseat.
Thank you, ambassadors, for your insight. My question was regarding US support to Israel. So a few days ago, I was watching an interview of a former Indian diplomat. He seemed to suggest that even though the US has tried to broker peace between all parties in this conflict, nothing concrete obviously hasn't been reached so far. He also seemed to suggest that the Israelis might be taking the Americans for a ride. So how much truth do you think is there in this suggestion? And do you think the Americans will ever be able to take any concrete, will they be able to influence the actors in this conflict in the future as well? Because everyone, as you said, is taking a maximalist stance. Thank you.
All I can say is if they're taking them for a ride, they seem to be enjoying the ride at the moment. But it's a good point. The Israelis post-67 and more post-73 have spent a huge, I mean the two big wars they had, effort in establishing influence over opinion, politics, local activism in the United States. A huge, huge effort has gone into this. And that's a grip they don't want to let go. Why? Because every time the US has taken an even-handed stance, they find, they run into difficulties. The most famous is 1956, when they refused to back off, Eisenhower literally told them that their money would start getting cut off. They would lose access to the financial markets. And within 3 weeks, the IDF withdrew and things started coming back to normal. They don't want that kind of a situation where they can be pressured. But they will have a problem, because we heard about this. There is a growing segment of opinion among the young in the United States, irrespective of political affiliation at the moment, but almost largely democratic, which feels that they have gone too far in identification with Israel, particularly when there are these glaring crises, etc. And everyone believes that, Trump is an ardent supporter of Israel. He is. He's the one who moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he has supported them every time. But Trump has his followers who are, what is the MAGA, Make America Great Again. That's the shorthand for them. The one thing they don't want is US troops involved in another war abroad. So if Israeli actions drag the Americans into a war in Iran or anywhere associated with that, you will see opinion beginning to shift a little. So I think, yes, they have a very, very strong grip on American opinion, particularly in the Congress, in the political opinion, which is what matters. But they also have a across-the-board influence in the media, in the universities, and among many people who are just thinking about what the world is like. They are sympathetic towards Israel. But I think this particular round of war and the Gaza destruction has begun to chip away at that a little. And I think they would try to restore that. That's the way I see it. But right now, I don't think the Americans feel they're being taken for a ride. But if they do, they will react.
I would just like to add there, that I think you have to also understand the nature of the pro-Jewish lobbies in America. That's very, very important. They truly, as Ranjan said, control the media. They control a good deal of, they have a terrific influence in Congress and in other places. So, essentially that is what gives the strength to Israeli positions being backed by America. I think you've got a lot of questions on this side. You've not been, yeah.
Hi, thanks for your remarks. I wanted to ask you to put this a little bit in the perspective of a changing world order. And I wanted to ask if you really think it is in our national interest, because the international perception is that we are tying ourselves to the West. But in the West, we have the US, which is a declining power. And of course, Europe is already, doesn't have that kind of international. So why attach ourselves in support of what is being perceived as a genocide? And what is a genocide? To a Western alliance, rather than try and build regional alliances and say that Asia can handle its own affairs. And I wanted to see if you can talk about it.
Good question. Changing world order. Europe, as you pointed out. US in decline is a bit of a question mark. There's certainly signs of it. But if you look at the arc of history, take 1970 to 2024, where we are today. Global economy, which were the main players in it? The United States may have slipped from 25% to 20, but not less than that. It's Europe which has slipped, Japan which has slipped. Who has risen? China. Are you thinking of an Asian group of nations to sort out problems with China in its lead? It's a possibility. The Chinese are certainly aiming at it. I don't think it makes anyone in Delhi, or at least I hope in Bangalore too, very comfortable. So I don't think we're likely to go that way. That's a short-term answer. The point you're making is well taken. Why tie yourself in? Right now, what is the option? We have, in fact, looked as far as we can. We have tried with Japan. I've been involved. She's been involved. All of us know. Irrespective of the nature of the government, we have tried working with the Japanese, bringing in Japanese investment, trying to get Japanese technology, involving Japan more. But we don't want to join an Asian NATO, which is what Shigeru Ishiba is now talking about. But we'd like to see Japanese influence grow. So we have tried. We are working with the Europeans to the extent they are. We are working with those in the Arab world who are significant financially. We are trying all that. But when it comes to moving, changing facts on the ground, today it's the United States. There was Russia, which has weakened itself, and there is China, and we are aspiring to get there. Our problem is China. Let's face the fact. China believes in a multipolar world. It doesn't believe in a multipolar Asia. Asia should be led by China. So that's a reality we are not going to get away from very soon, unless, as I and many of us hope, the Chinese aren't doing as well as they claim they are.
We can have one more question. One or two maximum. Yeah, we have 5 more minutes, so two questions.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. So thank you to the panelists. Ma'am, you were talking about military disparities being there in the Middle East or West Asia. So I wanted to ask on that and explore more that how these things about military disparity or the perception of military disparity where certain countries are getting more support could affect this conflict that is folding and emergence of proxy actors which are going to play in future. And you see a lot of proxy and proxy wars or non-state actors playing their roles. So what would you have to say on
I
that?
would say in this particular conflict, they're already playing a role, obviously, Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on and so forth. You know, the proxies are only a part of the problem. The real issue is the conflict between Iran and Israel at the moment. So while proxies do play their part and they are part of this axis that they talk about, I would say the more important thing is how do Iran and Israel come to an accommodation of each other's interests.
Thank you. The last question. One more? Okay.
Hi, thank you to the panel. My question was ignoring the Palestinian question in the Abraham Accords a mistake? And do you see, if Trump gets re-elected, do you see him resolving this conflict? Because his team is full of China hawks and he wants to focus on China instead of the Middle East.
Basra, you would like to take that?
Well, his team, I mean, I think one of the reasons the United States would be keen to see a resolution in West Asia is precisely what you said. It knows that its key foreign policy challenge lies in East Asia, it lies in the rise of China. But West Asia won't go away. It's like a limpet which is going to hold on, so they will have to work with it. And there are significant groups within the Congress and others who are committed to, you know, working for a resolution of the West Asian issue. On whose side they are is a different matter. But it will remain a key priority of the White House, irrespective of who wins, and even if Trump wins. I personally see that not going away.
And just to add to that, I think that whoever wins the election, whether it's Kamala Harris or whether it's Trump, they will go with the traditional position of the US. I don't think they have a choice because of the strength of the Jewish lobbies in America.
Just the Jewish lobby, I mean, just take for a minute. One of the reasons a lot of activism took place was that if this had blown up, say, 3 months earlier and the war had really become serious, you would have had a breakdown in oil markets. And a crisis in oil, which drives up oil prices, is a political crisis in any country which is facing an election. Any country. And the United States is particularly sensitive because it's in the middle of a very huge debate about should we be producing more oil or should we be transitioning to an era of green energy, etc., etc. So there's a huge debate going on there. So West Asia, as far as it is the source of a significant part of globally traded oil, of global trade and global finance, it will remain very, very important to world politics.
Yeah, so I mean, I recognize that there's a lot of issues going on in Sudan and Congo and things like that. But right now, what we're seeing people being burnt alive right now through social media and things like that. And I just want to know, like, you know, it's been more than a year now that we've had this genocide going on in Palestine. Are we looking at another year of genocide continuing?
Frankly, there is no easy answer to this question because I think Israel will continue with its policy of harassing, if you like, the people in Gaza, and you know, they basically, it's a no-win situation because these people have nowhere to go because Egypt has refused to accept them. So they have nowhere to go, so they have to stay in Gaza and continue to be subjected to atrocities. So frankly, that's the way I see it evolving, and how long it'll go on for is anybody's guess. Ranjan?
I think there's no such thing as a comparative study of genocide. I mean, but the fact is, I mean, the kind of casualties which have taken place, the kind of crimes which have been committed in some of the other regions you cited have been as significant, if not more, in terms of sheer numbers. So that's also a fact. That does not, for a minute, take away the need to focus laser sharp on what's in front of our eyes. As you said, it's being shown on social media and so on. But when you're in a discussion and a debate, and some of the people from those regions get up and ask you, have you forgotten us? You know, then you have to be able to answer them. I know for a fact that people from Sudan, there was a significant Indian community in Omdurman and so on. They sometimes do ask, why have you forgotten us? You have completely forgotten that such a country exists, that such people exist. There's a civil war. People are dying. There's starvation. So this is a fact of life. It depends, you know, the famous expression, where you stand, it depends on where you sit on any given issue. You know, so that's the point. You look at the world, what's close to you, what are you receiving, what are you reacting to, and you respond to that. So the fact is that others might see that as partial.
Thank you. So a horrible humanitarian tragedy is unfolding in Gaza. And Israel sees an opportunity to take the war to its rivals, which is what Israel is trying to do now against Hezbollah, against Iran. Iran is under pressure, but the panelists do not see any immediate ease in the unfolding confrontation between the Iranians and the Israelis. And the Russians and the Chinese, they are playing a minimal role at this point of time in the region. But the United States would continue to play a major role, and the United States continues to support Israel, irrespective of the crimes Israel is accused against. And India plays a middle path. So these are my takeaways from this wonderful conversation. I enjoyed this as much as anybody else. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ranjan Mathai and Ambassador Latha Reddy and everybody else.